So, I'm here to warm up the crowd and get everybody excited for the real stuff that's actually coming. So my name's Jim Palmer. I work for Ruckus. A few years ago, I gave up trying to figure out what my title is. And I'm just a Wi-Fi person. I really have no idea what I do or how I do it or why I do it. I just like doing it. But I'm going to talk about MLO. We've been sort of talking and teasing MLO for a while. And one of the things that I've learned, and I've been talking to some of the other vendors, and it's the same thing they've learned, there's kind of a misunderstanding on what MLO is and how it works and how it doesn't work and how the expectations are different. And so I'm going to take some time, and we're going to go through sort of the technical explanation of multi-link operation. I've been using this slide for a while now, longer than I care to admit, but it basically is kind of the idea of what multi-link operation is. And Fernay helped me out a while, but you have this multi-link devices. You have two of them. And in this case, I'm not showing one's an AP and one's a client because it kind of can go back and forth. But when we get into it, there are some differences that come into that play, but this is basically how it's kind of built in a simplified front end or back end of how these things link together. The whole purpose of MLO is to solve some problems, whether it's resiliency, throughput, or latency, by doing some operations. So that's sort of hey, this is the explanation of what we're doing, but you'll see here in a second that even, we have these two links, multi-link, but we accomplished solving these three problems by doing 4 different things, because why wouldn't you? This is all going to be up on with the slide deck, because eventually I'll send it to Matthew. So this is just mainly some terminology for you guys to reference later on. If you thought initialism was bad before Wi-Fi 7, 802.11be, I got bad news for you, because it is just a minefield of mess. This is another one of those little reference slides that I threw in there for you guys to kind of figure out hey, this is where within the MLO information element, where these different key things live. So when you start to try to drill down into all of this information, this is where that stuff lives. Again, I'm giving away the deck so you can use this for a reference later. So I said there was 4 different modes of operation, and here they are. What I want to really point out to you, though, is there are really just sort of 2 major things. We have multi-radio, and then we have 2 single radios. So 2 multi, 2 single. And so you have asynchronous, synchronous, multi-link single radio, enhanced multi-link single radio, and of course we all get the async, sync, MR, MLSR. And so to remember these things, it's just easy to remember that there's 2 that are multi-radio, and then there's 2 that are single radio. So it's when I first saw this, I was just like my mind just turned to jello, because I was like, how am I ever going to do this? And working on it, I figured out, okay, yeah, it's really just we have 2 multi-radio and 2 single radios. Now, this is the 3 things that we were trying to solve with multi-link operation. And so it actually does kind of line up and match, and you'll see that when we get into these 4 different modes of what this really means. Now, in my title slide, I said that we had a little bit of dampening, because I am going to rain on some parades. The first thing I'm going to rain on is that not all chipsets support all the different modes. So, it really depends. Where's Sam? Okay, good, he didn't hear that. It really, really depends on what your client device is, what your AP is, what chipsets they have, about which mode you're going to be able to do. So if a chipset in the AP cannot do one of the modes, then there's no chance. If your client device can't do one of the modes, then there's no chance. And more importantly, to even rain on your parade a little bit more, we also have firmware, and as Phil and I were talking the other day, it turns out software as well. He had the drivers for an Intel BE200, he had the AP, he had everything except he needed the Windows patch in order to enable it. And so it took him months to get the operating system up to where it would even use the multi-link operation. So when you start thinking about all these things that have to come together in order to make MLO work, it's one of those things that I told somebody, like, yeah, MLO works. Okay, cool. MLO doesn't work. Sure. Because nothing will surprise me anymore. It's going to work. It's not going to work. We're still very much in this learning curve. The bleeding edge, there is a reason why this is called bleeding edge. As you start working on this, you're going to have some blood, sweat, and tears into this. So let's go through what these actually mean so you can kind of see how I got to my conclusion. So I am doing my supporting stuff, and then I'll do the conclusion at the end. So asynchronous multi-link, multi-radio. You got 2 MACs, you got 2 PHYs. You can do repeated transmissions in this. It's okay, but it increases overhead. But in order to get the asynchronous operation, you got to have some specific stuff running. And to make this all work, radio physics are still in play. If you've heard me talk before, I like talking about the radio physics. It's not just a good idea, it's the law. This mode is also the most advantageous operating model because we get benefits in latency and bandwidth. But this is still Wi-Fi, so we don't ever get anything for free. I want to call your attention to a couple things. First, this mode, the 2 MACs and those 2 radios, because it's multi-link, multi-radio, they contend for the channel access independently, which means they're just doing their own thing. And Fernade went off on Slack about 10 months ago, and I stole it from my Phoenix presentation, where he was talking about this is why MLO is not going to work, because in this particular mode, yes, those radios are operating independently on the same device in order to send the same data, but they're operating independently. And because they're operating independently, you have to put in filters and all these other things. Because if you think getting 2 APs close together is bad, think about getting 2 radios inside this guy close together and go, oh yeah, we're just going to let them run wild and free without any care for each other. I mean, you think it's bad getting APs close? This is worse. So now what does this look like? What does it actually look like? So the thing to remember here is the devices can receive on one link while it's transmitting on the other. And so it looks something like this, where they can actually send on one link while they're receiving on the other link. Now these bands can change. You can have 2.4, you can have 6, but they operate independently. They go back and forth, they can do whatever they want. But if you notice, when we're transmitting and receiving on the same device with those 2 radios, one's transmitting, one's receiving, that's where that filtering and isolation comes in. We found that you pay a penalty of about 2 to 3 dB of loss with that filtering in order to make this mode work. So it's cool, it's nice, it's fun, but it has its drawbacks. The next one we want to cover, synchronous multi-link, multi-radio. This one, you still have 2 MACs, you have 2 PHYs, and they contend for the channel. This mode removes the filtering, so we don't have to pay that penalty anymore. But it does require some clean RF. And it's the most complex. If you thought that the asynchronous was complex, this is the most complex. And again, we have to pay, we don't get anything for free, because what we're doing here is they're trying to coordinate the channel access on those 2 spectrums, whether you're trying to coordinate 2.4 and 5, 2.4 and 6, 5 and 6, you're trying to coordinate access to 2 different channels at the exact same time. If we had a CWNA boot camp, right? You guys covered the dynamic coordination function, DCF, and you went, how does Wi-Fi even work? Now imagine trying to do that coordinated on 2 different bands, on 2 different radios at the exact same time. And then you tell me, how does this work at all? Which is why when somebody say, I didn't see that mode. Well, it's the most complex operating mode. So are you going to see this? Probably not. But how does this look? Now, the thing to remember is before, when we could transmit and receive at the same time, on this one, we can't receive on one link while we're transmitting on the other link. So what will happen is they'll synchronize, the synchronous multi-link, they'll synchronize on which one they trigger first. If you've ever done point-to-point links where you do a back-to-back relay and you have to have the sync between the two radios that are on the same pole pointing in, because you're doing like a repeater, you got to extend it and stuff like that, we're synchronizing. And so your coordinated access to the channel, and you have to synchronize across. So it's really cool. You can send a ton of data because you could send half of it on one radio, half of it on the other way. It's like a lag over the air. But as everybody in this room knows, trying to coordinate channel access in a high-density environment, yeah. So, next one, multi-link single radio. This one's okay. We have the device it has this configured data path and the MAC for the 2 channels. And because it's a single radio, it's in the name, it makes sense. This is actually it doesn't cost as much because you're not putting 2 radios in, you're only putting 1. So the cost of 1 radio is less than the cost of 2 radios. Math is fun. The AP has to support it, but as we all know, the APs will run its radios independently or at the same time anyway, so that problem's already been solved. This particular mode, you don't have any bandwidth gain, but it can reduce latency. But it has a little thing. It can only do 1 band at a time. So while it's multi-link, it's still only single radio, but it only can do 1 band at a time, kind of like what we have today. But what happens is just like it sounds like, it turns off. In this particular case, my multi-link device A is the client, so it turns off that other radio. So it's still talking up here on link 1, then all of a sudden it goes, oh, we have a problem, let me turn off and go down to link 2, and we're gonna talk down here back and forth. But the problem you have is, so multi-link device B is, I just made this my AP because it was on the right and that felt comfortable for me. But what happens is the client device, multi-link device A, those radios are turning off and then on. They go back and forth. They're not on at the same time. One goes off, and then one goes on. I'll point out to you that this particular one is called a power save mode. So if you've ever worked with iPhones and the battery gets low, and you find out it goes from 2 spatial streams to 1 spatial stream because it's saving power, or it cuts its transmit power because it's trying to save power on your battery. So while this isn't a operating mode that we expect to see, because it has the power save in there, I expect to see times where if you get MLO working, that's a big if, I know that's doing a lot of work here, you can be like, well, it worked well in the morning, but in the afternoon it started getting a little flaky. Well, because in the afternoon when the battery's running low, it might turn that other radio off. And so if you think about all the conversations we've had here so far this week and the ones we're about to have, think about it if you walked around with your hand covering 1 ear. You're only listening at 1 at a time, and then you switch. You're gonna miss stuff over here. And so this brings me to the final mode, which is the enhanced multi-link single radio. Now this is very similar to what we have with just multi-link single radio. We still have all the same things. It all sort of flies together, again, no bandwidth gain. But the key difference here is really that it can listen on both channels at the same time. Now for me, that is really critical. This is the one part of MLO that I love the most, is listening on both channels. Because before when I was saying, oh yeah, you're in a big room, we're all talking, and you're listening with 1 ear covered like this, you're missing out on half of it. You don't know what's going on over there because you can't hear. But with both ears on, and you're listening on 2 different bands, it gives your devices, your AP already has this information because it already kind of works this way, but your client device is now paying attention to both bands at the same time, so it has situational awareness, it has spatial awareness of what's going on. So when this thing is fired up and working, what you'll see is that other radio is still listening. And so it can make the switch a lot sooner if it says, hey, I need to switch because I'm hearing things on this other channel that I don't like, so let me switch it really quick. But it's always listening on that other channel, so it's enhanced. So it makes that switch a lot faster, which is really kind of what we're looking for, is to be able to switch back and forth and have that situational and spatial awareness for our client devices. Our client devices are finally gonna start paying attention to what we've been paying attention to for years and complaining that our client devices, who are the dumbest part of the network, are the ones making all the decision. Well, they're still making all the decisions, which means that the client device will then decide if it's gonna use MLO or not. We can't force it, but at least now the client device is paying attention to the stuff that the people in this room have been paying attention to for years. So that's what makes me the most excited about this one particular mode. It's cheaper for the clients because we're still only talking about one radio, but it gives our client devices an enhanced listening on the channel. Now, there are some other interesting things that come along with this. Total client support on an AP. When a device registers on radio 1 and then it registers on radio 2, that's 2 devices on your total AP count, not 1. So if you have a limit on your APs saying I'm only going to let 100 devices connect and you get 50 MLO devices, that's 100. That's not 50 anymore because now they're on both. Split MAC addresses, kind of the same idea. MAC address derivation, I know the planning tool guys, it's like, if I can, how do I determine what it is? I don't know what the other vendors are doing, but what I can tell you is Ruckus is using the 5 gigahertz MAC as the MLD MAC. It's that higher level MAC, so that's, for whatever good that'll do you, that's how Ruckus is doing it. And then there's a roaming implication. So we had this discussion last night at the CWNE event, and I asked this question. I said, with MLO, and you've already established those 2 data paths, is it really a roam anymore when you go from one band to the other band? Is it a roam? And then what happens in 802.11bn, Wi-Fi 8? I said it first. What happens because there was an MLO feature that got pushed to Wi-Fi 8, 802.11bn, that was multi-AP MLO. I talk on one band to one AP, one band to the other AP. But if I've already established that data path on 2 different APs, on 2 different radios, and I start moving, all I'm doing is just stopping to send data from here and send it over here, and I slowly move over here. Is that a roam? Because you've already established your data path. You've already established your MAC on 2 APs. I don't know. It's a thought game. And in 4 years, hopefully somebody's standing up here and explaining it to me. So in the last 11 minutes, I'm going to go through 20 minutes worth of bang for your buck, because this is what everyone wants to know. MLO in action. Does it work? What type of benefits do we get? Well, let's take a look. Oh yeah, I discovered the cool transitions in PowerPoint. In the downlink, the thing I want you to pay attention to with these couple of graphs here is at the bottom. The 6 gigahertz is in blue, the 5 gigahertz is in orange. And we're doing packets per second. The tool that we use to measure this stuff actually ties into the radio interfaces, and we can pull the data off the radio interface. I tried to get it here so we could play, and they turned me down because it's apparently way too expensive for me. So, but this is what we have. When you introduce that interference in the 6 gigahertz band, because the thing is, with 6 gigahertz having much cleaner spectrum and wider channels, devices are going to prefer that. They're going to want to be there. So we had to force them off of 6 onto 5, and we could do that by using co-channel interference. Set some statics, co-channel interference, switches over, sends the data, turn it off, it goes back. And because we can't see the radios, we can't tell from here if it's doing, which version of MLO it's doing, but we can see, but each one of those dots is 1 second apart. So if you know how much data can go in 1 second, you don't know, we're not really quite sure. And they didn't consult me, so I couldn't run some other tests to find out exactly what they're doing. Same thing works on the uplink, except with the uplink, the client device having not great as radios, you see a little bit more spiky in there, but it does work in both directions. But what does it do? What does it actually do? So this is Wi-Fi 7 without MLO. And we're looking at throughput here, and this is over about a 2-minute time span. Upload is super spiky on the top. Download, not as bad, but it is spiky. But when you turn on MLO, what you see is just a steady, constant data flow as the client device steers and moves back and forth and picks the band that it wants to run on. Now, if you've heard me talk before, you've heard me say that I like my networks to be spiky. I don't like them to be flat. But that's the whole network. This is a client. I want my client to have steady performance. I don't care that it's not spiking up to 800. And I have a way to explain this. And this is where we're going to do some audience participation in these last 10 minutes and get you all warmed up for Peter's talk so that we're all excited and interesting to go. I'm going to explain why I like this better than this spiky one, and I'm going to use a very old reference of a movie called Cannonball Run. Now, Cannonball Run came out in 1971. 1981. The race was in 71, and I didn't realize this until I built this slide, but this is actually going to be part 4 because Germans created a part 3 and didn't tell anybody. I knew about 1 and 2, so this is 4. Now, for those who don't know, Cannonball Run was a movie. Yeah, you can tell by the poster, from 1981, and it's about a race. Now, this is a pretty interesting race because what happens is you start on the East Coast in Manhattan and you get to the West Coast as fast as you can. Those are the rules. So if you think about a race like this, and you think about, who would win this race? Now, who thinks that this car won the race? This is actually the opening scene from the movie. Nobody thinks this car won the race. But what car would you pick? Would you pick a car like this one? I don't know. How come nobody's... what about this car? There's no participation? Now, I saved my favorite car for this. A Porsche. Oh, thank you. Porsche 911 GT3 RS. Now, what if I told you that only one of those cars was actually in the race? But this was also in the race. And one of these. And in fact, this one won the race in 1971. It got across America in 54 hours. Now, the reason why they did this is because they understood consistency. So what they did is they loaded up a bunch of 55-gallon drums of fuel in the back of that thing, and then they had a hand crank that they would hand crank the gas into the fuel tank so they didn't have to stop. That won. Because it didn't have to stop. It kept going at a very consistent rate. What they figured out was it's not how, going 800 miles an hour is cool, but going a constant 65 or 70 was actually a more efficient way to win the race. So that's what won. And this holds true even till today. This is a 2019 Audi A8. This set the record. And I think it still holds, but it was an unofficial record because they did it during COVID when nobody was out on the roads. This Audi A8 did it in 26 hours and 38 minutes. It got from one side of the country to the other side of the United States, thousands and thousands of miles in 26 hours. But it carried over what they lessons learned back in 1971. And that is this little tank right here, auxiliary fuel tanks, so they didn't have to stop as much. That is why when I look at this graph and I say, wow, this thing right up here, that spiked at almost 600 megabits per second. 600 megabits per second. Why would I ever say that I want something that just sits at 240, 250 and just sits there the entire time? Well, because yes, it got to 800 miles per hour or 600 miles per hour, but it spent most of its time down here at 88 miles per hour. Now, maybe it needed 1.21 gigawatts to be added to that. Really? I thought I would have gotten a lot more laughs than that. Because, look, at the end of the day, you can have a Lamborghini Gallardo, but if you're stuck behind a Honda CR-V in traffic, it doesn't matter. So you can have a client, and we stand up here from vendors and we say, you can do 48 gigabits per second and it's going to do... But we still have Honda CR-Vs on the road. So I would much rather be able to do a constant 200 as opposed to spiking up to 800 because it's really fun, and then I immediately slam on the brakes because I'm stuck in traffic behind some Wi-Fi 5 joker who won't upgrade his device. And so this is why I like that flat steady, because it's a consistent, stable connection. I don't need it to do 800, but a consistent, stable 250? Think about that for a second. When I started in Wi-Fi, it was like, 600 megabits per second. Yes, that was like the gold standard. And then all of a sudden we got to like 800, and then we started going higher and higher. And now we're to the point where we're like 250 megabits per second isn't good enough because I need 5 gigabits per second. Really? It's fun, but it's not. What does it get you? You're stuck behind traffic. So I'm doing good on time. Latency. What happens with latency with MLO? This one is actually probably my favorite graph of all the testing we did, is looking at latency. Now, these are measured at the 99th percentile. For those who don't know, 99th percentile means that 99% of all of your frames did this. And so it's basically all of it. We're just going to statistically say that this is what you see. The latency that we saw without MLO running for the uplink was 58 milliseconds at that point. Now, 58 milliseconds isn't bad, but it's not great. But when you look at the downlink, it was 483 milliseconds of latency. The majority of our packets were at about 483 milliseconds of latency. Now, for those who don't know, the difference there is, if you have latency of 483 milliseconds, that's when you start throwing up when you're wearing VR headsets because you're gonna get car sick. This is not a good thing, and we have to fix that because we're going to all these low latency and latency sensitive things. So when we turn MLO on, that 99th percentile where we're still measuring changes. We have a 19 times improvement in the uplink at the 99th percentile. That means we went from 58 milliseconds of latency to 3 milliseconds of latency. That's pretty good. But the downlink was even better. Now remember, that was 483 milliseconds. It went to 22 milliseconds of latency. So 3 on the uplink, 22 on the downlink. That is cool. And I tried to tell this to my wife, and she looked at me like I was, and I'm like, I gotta bring this to some people to look at that and go, wow, that's cool. So that's the type of performance improvements that we've seen. Now, will it work all the time? Probably not. But luckily, we have some other things that MLO sort of works together because all of this stuff just is working together to deliver the Wi-Fi that we really want. So this is a little bit of a marketing thing, but I kind of liked it. And I spent 2 days on this animation, so you're going to get it. So we have resiliency for difficult Wi-Fi conditions like channel congestion, co-channel interference, and better, we need these things to get us better resiliency. We also need redundancy improvements, for reliability, real-time transport protocols, whether it's voice, video, whatever. We still need that, and we need this predictable roaming. So as we move, we're able to track it. And that's why it's like this is really a stepping stone to 802.11bn when we try to get those multi-AP MLOs working. Latency improvements for timely information, doing stuff like dynamic band selection. That's cool. The average of 20.5% improve or 20.5 times improvement because VR demands low latency. And then we have sustained, and all this working together gives us sustained predictable throughput so we can optimize our network performance, have flexible network operations, which just simply gives us better Wi-Fi. So it's all working together. As all these things work together, that is what is the cool thing about Wi-Fi 7 because it's not just now, but it's also going into the future. So, thank you.